Hi and welcome to Debunk File. My name is Sup and today we're going to be talking about one of the most famous unsolved murder cases in American history. This is, of course, the Black Dahlia case. Now, if you've been watching us for a while, I'm sure you may be scratching your head thinking, an unsolved murder case? Yeah, mysteries like these are usually something that we like to stay away from, but the Black Dahlia is something entirely different. While it's one of the most famous unsolved murder cases, and thus most people know of it, it's still immensely intriguing, and more importantly, it's completely filled to the brim with misinformation, which we will have none of in our video. Before we begin, I have a couple of shoutouts that I would like to give here. First off, I have to give a shoutout to Vertigo22. This is the person that convinced me to do this mystery in the first place and wound up linking me to the next person I have to shout out, which is Tyler Bio Rodriguez right here, who heavily helped me with the research and wrote his own piece on this case, which I will link in the description. Tyler told me about a person named Larry Harnich, who is an LA Times writer for nearly 30 years and has been endlessly researching the Black Dahlia case since the 90s. In a sea of misinformation, he's the only one with a firm grasp on the truth, and his information is what will predominantly be used in this video. But first, we must go back to the day of the tragedy, January 15th, 1947. The day began as any other day does. The birds were chirping and the sky was clear and sunny despite a cold temperature of 31 degrees. Countless people were out on their morning walks. However, for a lady named Betty Bersinger, this walk would be anything but normal. While walking along the undeveloped lots in Leimert Park, she noticed what at first glance appeared to be a mannequin, until she got closer. What she saw was one of the most horrific and soon-to-be infamous murders in the history of the United States. Lifelessly staring back at her was the recently deceased Elizabeth Short. And before we continue the mystery at hand, let's talk a little bit about Elizabeth, or Betty as she prefers to be called. Over the years, she has been riddled with an exorbitant amount of misinformation. You see, if you read articles about her or watch YouTube videos, you are going to hear so many ridiculous things. You most likely hear that Betty was a girl that loved to party, that she dated a mobster, that she dabbled in prostitution, and she was last seen at the Cecil Hotel. You'll also hear that she was a lesbian, her middle name was Anne, hell, even the name of the origin, the Black Dahlia, which is often said to have come from the press to sell more paper, is completely false, as we'll get to later. As you can probably tell, most of, if not all of these fabrications that are still believed to be true to this day, came from the yellow journalism of the 40s. You see, back in the 1940s, well, hell, even today in some cases, a practice known as yellow journalism was widely used, and it involved highly exaggerated headlines in order to increase their sales, and often featured no ounces of effort in their research. In this case, the blame predominantly falls to the William Randolph Hearst-owned Los Angeles Examiner and the Herald Express, although most newspapers at the time also covered the murder extensively. See, in 1947, there were 4 major papers, all fighting for readers in Los Angeles. There was the LA Times, the Examiner, the Herald Express, and the Daily News. The fairly conservative Times and the Examiner were the morning edition papers. The Herald Express was published in the afternoon, and the Daily News was a cheap tabloid paper that published at all times of the day. The Examiner and Herald Express both greatly emphasized crime, often to a sensational degree. The Times most ignored the crime, and Daily News posted garbage nonsense constantly. The Examiner was the largest of all 4 papers and the most morally dubious, for reasons we will get to. The Herald Express is one of the key reasons why people assume this was the work of a serial killer, because they constantly made comparisons to other murders at the time. But the Examiner was definitely the paper most associated with the Black Dahlia. The paper more or less ran its own investigation and played a key role in the discovery of evidence and a key suspect, along with other less helpful information. As a direct result of the actions taken by the Examiner, Herald Express, and other smaller papers, people believed the many falsehoods that were reported, and later on, various works of fiction would draw inspiration from these falsehoods, creating even more lies. Even more lies were intentionally or not spread by people writing articles, videos, or books decades down the road inspired by that same false information. Even the best intentions often fail because virtually all the books on the subject are drawing from this false information, so unless you live in LA, you're at the mercy of decades of bad research. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. With all that being said, though, now let me tell you guys what Betty Short was really like. Born on July 29th, 1924, Betty's short life in many ways was pretty tragic. Her early life was spent in Medford, Massachusetts, and when she was just 5 years old, her family was struck by the Great Depression, as many Americans were. Her father built miniature golf courses for a living, but in 1930 that business was completely squashed, and her father subsequently abandoned them. To make matters even worse, she also suffered from asthma, prompting her to move to Florida at the age of 16 to escape the harsh winters of Massachusetts. This would be her first time moving in a life that would be full of constant moving. Unlike what articles stated about her personality, she was described by a multitude of people, such as neighbors and actresses, as being a pretty and nice girl who was well-behaved and innocent, which contradicts most articles already, which painted her as this party-goer. The worst that could be said is that she was sometimes a tease. Anyways, eventually her father, Cleo Short, would return, sending her some money, and she subsequently moved in with him in California. However, their relationship was never close, as she was out of the house more often than not, before moving back to Florida in 1944, following an arrest, and she ended up falling in love with Major Matthew Martin Gordon Jr., who was in the United States Army Air Force and was tragically killed just a year later after a plane crash. That is, of course, if you believe her version of the events, but again, we'll get to that. In 1946, she would move to LA after meeting another pilot in Florida, Lieutenant Joseph Gordon Fickling, and during these last few months, her situations were quite sporadic, as there were 3 confirmed places she lived in this time span. There was a rented place at 6024 Carlos Ave under the name Mark Hansen, who you'll hear about more later. There was the Hawthorne Hotel on Orange Drive and the Chancellor Apartments at 1842 North Cherokee, which, as a side note, is the only location that is still standing all these years later. These sporadic living conditions are a result of her being unemployed during this entire span of her life. She more or less lived off the kindness of strangers. This again contradicts a popular part of the lore, which is the fact that she was a waitress at this time. This is also where the ultra-famous nickname Black Dahlia came from, despite what once again is rumored to be true. It's commonly believed that she earned this nickname due to the press, but it actually was conceived at a drugstore Betty used to frequent in Long Beach. Customers would often call her the Black Dahlia due to how she wore her hair and because of the popular 1946 noir film, The Blue Dahlia. The original working name popular in the papers was the Werewolf Murder due to the brutal nature, but instead, Black Dahlia caught on like wildfire and the press took all the credit. Towards the end, she took a trip to San Diego and ended up moving into the household of the French family, and they described her again as never staying in the home. She was always out and about. During one of her times out, she met a man named Robert Red Manley, who she got along great with, and who even offered her a job interview, which she would never attend. After getting kicked out of the French family's home, she went to Manley, who drove her back to LA and dropped her off at the Biltmore Hotel late on January 9th, and what would be the last time anyone saw her alive. For 6 days, she was unaccounted for until the morning of the 15th. Now, if I can describe Betty as a person, I would say she was tragic and confusing. Nearly everyone who knew her described her as being very well-mannered and an overall good person, but due to her financial situation throughout her entire life, especially towards the end, she would often lie in order to gain sympathy out of people. For example, while she claimed Matthew Gordon was the love of her life, his family claims Betty made up the whole love story. Another lie was the famous myth of her being a wannabe film starlet. Despite reportedly telling her mother, Phoebe, it's likely that she lied about wanting to be a film star since there was no evidence of her ever attending casting calls or anything of the sort. It is still entirely possible she wanted to be an actress, however, even if this was true, it was not the root cause of her moving to LA like it's often claimed to be. While these actions are morally questionable, I wouldn't call her a bad person or anything, I'd call her a tragic one. And speaking of tragedy, it's time to go back to that day. January 15th, 1947. As stated before, she was spotted in an undeveloped lot in South Norton Avenue, where she was drained of blood and resembled a mannequin more than a human. The most disturbing part, she was cut into 2 pieces between the second and third lumbar vertebrae, and the cut was so clean that not a single internal organ was even touched, suggesting that this could have only been done by a skilled surgeon. Her arms, legs, and neck all featured ligature marks, indicating that she was tied down. Death had been brought on by multiple lacerations to her face after being knocked unconscious by repeated blows to the head. The mutilation occurred after she passed away. She was also heavily washed, and as such, no fingerprints could be found, a key reason why this mystery has lasted to this day. Betty was identified by law enforcement after matching her fingerprints with the prints taken following her arrest in 1943. After the identification, Betty's mother, Phoebe, had to be informed of what happened to her child. Unfortunately, the LAPD were not the ones to break it to her. It was the Examiner. Rewrite man Wayne Sutton and city editor Jimmy Richardson called Phoebe and told her that Betty had won a beauty contest. They prodded her for information about Betty until they felt she wasn't giving anything useful. They then bluntly told Phoebe her daughter hadn't won anything. She was dead. One other strange event worth noting was that 10 days after the investigation, the Examiner was mailed some of Betty's personal belongings, which included her social security card, birth certificate, and an old address book with some missing pages that belonged to the aforementioned Mark Hansen. All other letters sent in were deemed hoaxes by the LAPD. No fingerprints were retrieved from the letter. So now that we have a background of who Betty was as a person, and now that we've explained the condition of the body, what we're going to do is just jump right into the suspects. Since this is such a famous case, there have been literally over 100 suspects listed throughout the years. So we're going to heavily narrow it down to include the most popular suspects, and obviously, we will include what we think is the most likely suspect. So, without further ado, let's dive in. The first suspect we must talk about is Robert Manley, who we mentioned earlier. If you don't remember, Manley was the very last person with her, as he was the man that dropped Betty off at the Biltmore, and as such, he has always been a very popular suspect in this case. But was Manley actually behind this? Well, let's first look at who Robert Manley actually was. There isn't a ton of info available about Manley, but we do know that he was in the military and was actually discharged due to mental illness. Because of this and the fact that he hooked up with Betty, it's easy to understand why he was such a popular suspect. And when investigators found out about this information, they ran a polygraph test on him, which he passed. Although it's worth noting that early polygraphs were primitive as hell and couldn't be used in court anyway. Jumping way forward to the 50s, he was committed to a mental hospital where for one final time they ran another test on him to see if he was truly behind this case after all. And once again, it was proven that he was not. Apparently, these never-ending suspicions on whether or not he was a suspect of this case really destroyed Manley mentally, who was already an unstable man. So, while he had a troubling past and was the last person that Betty interacted with, he was absolutely not the person behind this case. Consider this one debunked. The next suspect that we felt the need to shed some light on was Mark Hansen, who was another guy that we mentioned previously. Mark Hansen was the business manager of the Florentine Gardens nightclub. The Danish-born businessman also ran quite a few second-run theaters in the LA area, such as the Mark Hall, and was famously shy and private. The reason he became a suspect was because of the items sent to the Examiner 10 days after the event, which, as we stated, contained an address book owned by Hansen himself. We also specified that Betty actually stayed at Mark Hansen's place for a little while, which was something that left us confused for a little bit, but not much was actually known about their relationship at all, until JIF emailed Larry Harnish, who cleared things up. He logically answered the question, reminding us that this was very soon after World War II and America was under a housing crisis. Therefore, people taking others in wasn't actually too uncommon, and this was just one of those situations. Betty actually lived with Hansen on 2 separate occasions as well, where 2 different moments of friction caused her to move out. Originally, Betty and a friend lived with Hansen, but Hansen apparently did not like her friend, which caused both of them to move out. Her friend eventually left Hollywood, but Betty moved back to Hansen's place as she had nowhere else to go. This second stint was again short-lived, though, as after some sort of dispute, Betty moved out again, where she went to the aforementioned Chancellor Apartments, and finally, San Diego. Overall, they didn't have nearly as complex of a relationship as initially thought, as these types of situations were actually more common than previously thought. Hansen was married at the time, but this didn't stop him from flirting with various women, possibly including Betty, but it didn't go any further than that. Again though, it's easy to see why he is such a popular suspect, but is he truly the man that did it? Definitely not. Hansen had absolutely no criminal record at all in his entire lifetime, despite what is often claimed. There's this very popular rumor out there that he was affiliated with organized crime in LA, but this wasn't true at all, as according to the police chief, these crime groups were very tribal. For example, one of them was Sicilian and the other was Jewish. Mark was neither of the above, so he would have never been trusted. So he was not an associate of such people like Mickey Cohen, Jack Dragna, and Bugsy Siegel. He also didn't have the necessary medical skills required to mutilate her body. Hansen's life was very much shaken up by Betty's death. That and an attempted murder by a striptease girl in 1949. Overall, Hansen is again easily debunked, but our next guy here rose to infamy for supposedly knowing about Betty through Hansen, and his name is Leslie Dillon. Leslie Dillon has one of the most interesting cases out of anybody, being that he actually contacted the LAPD himself, and he lived in Florida and not LA. The reason he contacted them was because he was an aspiring writer who was fascinated by the case after reading it. All we know about him from his life before this case was that he was a bellhop and, at one point, worked as a mortician's assistant for 3 weeks in Oklahoma City. He drove the ambulance for those 3 weeks for the record. Many people say that he was a morgue attendant, but this is not true. When contacting the LAPD, he would often have exchanges with a psychologist named Paul DeRiver, and during their exchange, Dillon said that he believed his friend Jeff Connors was actually responsible for this death. Eventually, this psychologist started believing that Connors never even existed, and Leslie actually created him in his head to cope with what he had done. DeRivers managed to trick Dillon into meeting him, leading to a long interrogation in which Dillon was treated very harshly. It's worth noting that DeRiver had a rather poor reputation in history prior to this event. He was not the most reliable of people. For about a day, it looked like the case was solved, but instead of confessing, Dillon sued. This led to a long public court trial which cleared him of any suspicion. The city of LA even had to pay him for all the damages. A key detail learned during this trial was that Dillon was actually in San Francisco during the date of January 15th, so it could not possibly be him. Now, a lot of people seem to claim that Leslie Dillon and Mark Hansen knew each other, but there is no evidence of this at all. The connection was only made because he was named a suspect during the grand jury investigation, launched as a result of DeRiver's mishandling of Dillon. All that came of it was a house investigation and a taped recording that revealed nothing involving Hansen, Dillon, or Betty. Leslie Dillon is often considered one of the most likely suspect, but this is clearly from people that either ignore evidence that proved his innocence, or people that never even really looked into him at all. So yeah, once again, this suspect is debunked. The next suspect is one that has become popular over the years, as he wasn't a suspect at the time. This suspect is actually a notable serial killer known as the Lipstick Killer. Yes, in recent years, many people believe that the Lipstick Killer was, in fact, the one behind this. So let's go over why this has become such a popular theory, because it's a pretty complicated one. If you don't know who the Lipstick Killer was, the title is pretty accurate. In Chicago in 1946, 3 women were brutally murdered, with one having a message written in red lipstick. It was an extremely disturbing case, but if you already know about this killer, I'm sure you are questioning something right now, and that is, how could it possibly be the Lipstick Killer if he was arrested in 1946? Being arrested in 1946, this date would obviously make no sense since the tragedy we're discussing happened in 1947. But that's where the theories come in. It's thought of by some people that the person who was arrested wasn't the Lipstick Killer. As of now, this theory most likely sounds like some ridiculous conspiracy, but the case is fairly controversial as to if the person who was actually arrested did the murders. There is evidence for and against this. The man who wound up being arrested and who served the rest of his life in prison was a kid named William Hirons, and he was officially arrested in 1946 when he was just 17. Keep in mind, tensions were high at this time because these killings were quite horrific, and the city of Chicago was demanding justice. With that being said, Hirons was caught after breaking into an apartment and pointing a loaded revolver at the police. The interrogation was unimaginably awful. He was reportedly beaten numerous times during this span and was also not given any food or water for 6 days. He was given a lumbar puncture without any painkillers. He was given the highly controversial truth serum without the consent of his parents, and when under the serum's effect, he claimed that his alter ego, George Merman, may have been responsible for the murders. The press went wild, saying that his persona, Murder Man, had been the lipstick killer. He underwent 2 polygraph tests, and they both came back as inconclusive. The thing is, though, is that in the 1953 novel, Lie, Detection, and Criminal Interrogation by John E. Reed and Fred Inbow stated that, on the basis of the conventional testing theory, his response on the card test clearly establishes him as an innocent person. Although, once again, it's worth mentioning that polygraphs are not completely reliable. Other pieces of evidence pointing away from Hirons included his handwriting not matching the lipstick writing, and one person who may have spotted the killer reported the suspect was in his mid-30s. With all that being said though, Hirons was barely an angel. He was a habitual liar and a serial burglar. One of the houses he robbed was awfully close to the third victim, Suzanne Degnan's bedroom. He reportedly knew more about the crimes than a child his age should have known, and his fingerprints were found at one of the victims' houses and on a ransom note. He also definitely fired a gun he stole at a window, wounding a woman, so he was clearly very violent. Innocent or not, William Hirons pled guilty to all 3 murders, resulting in 3 life-term sentences in prison, where he lived the rest of his life until March 5th, 2012, when he passed away. Because of the many controversies in this case, it's not surprising that some people think the actual lipstick killer fled Chicago and LA in 1946 and killed Betty in 1947. At first glance, this theory now makes the timeline more plausible, but in reality, that's the only similarity that is shared here. Besides the time span making sense, there isn't anything that matches between these 2 cases. The victims of the lipstick killer didn't really share anything much in common with the Black Dahlia murder, outside of the last victim being dismembered. Overall, this case just seems too hypothetical for me, because it involves a killer from Chicago fleeing all the way to LA and then taking another victim. I don't know about you, but it just seems a little bit far-fetched. And heck, it's even entirely possible the 3 victims weren't even killed by the same person, seeing how 2 victims were stabbed and the last one was chopped up. On top of it all, it's entirely possible that the real lipstick killer was actually the man that was arrested for it. There also really isn't a connection to Betty, so I don't really see this as being our man. There is, however, one other suspect that was also a serial killer, and he was known as the Cleveland Torso Killer. This one is immediately more convincing, because every single body that this man got his hands on was dismembered, and they were also done in a way that clearly shows expertise in the medical field. From the years of 1935 to 1938, the Cleveland Torso Killer took an estimated 12 to 20 lives. Another noteworthy similarity was the type of victims he would seek out, which were nearly always drifters or homeless people, and with poor Betty basically being a vagrant, her profile matches up with the type of people this person sought out. Despite sounding extremely convincing from the surface though, when digging further into things, it starts to fall apart. For starters, while each body was dismembered, none of them were cut in half like Betty. All of his victims were either missing limbs or they were decapitated. The dates for this one is certainly strange as well, seeing how the spree abruptly ended for seemingly no reason in 1938. There are multiple theories as to why this spree ended so suddenly, such as the suspect either being killed or locked up. The Torso Killer was technically never found, but there was a man named Dr. Francis E. Sweeney that was taken away into a mental asylum in 1938, and this was right when the spree ended, which is pretty shady if you ask me. Sweeney was a former World War I soldier diagnosed with psychosis, and he had the necessary medical training to dismember a body. There is an alarming amount of similarities that suggest that he was likely behind the torso killings, but it still hasn't been proven for sure, and in reality, that incident would require a whole other video to talk about. Overall though, while being slightly more convincing than the lipstick killer, this one is still extremely unlikely. This theory, like that one, is based on the fact that this killer would have fled and just so happened to arrive in LA and start killing again. There's also a much larger difference in the date of each event, which limits the likelihood of this one. Unlike the lipstick killer, the LAPD actually addressed the two cases' similarities. They concluded that there was no connection, and it makes sense. The torso killer's victims were all dismembered and hidden. They were not meant to be found. Betty was placed in a spot where plenty of people walked by every single day. She was meant to be found. And as a finishing touch, as we stated earlier, the bodies, despite sounding similar, actually do feature rather large differences in dismemberment that further take away from the plausibility of the connection. So those were two very dark suspects back to back right there. And while it's impossible to truly get lighthearted in a situation like this, these next few suspects are actually insane and perfectly encapsulate the sheer convolution this entire case has around it. And why not start with the absolute most insane one? One of the newest suspects to the Black Dahlia case was a man named Jacob Edward Fisk. He's noteworthy as he is one of the only suspects to have completed a dedicated Wikipedia page. And when you look at this page, you'll see the sheer insanity of his case. To put it in the simplest of terms, Jacob Edward Fisk doesn't even exist. That's right, Jacob Edward Fisk was a prank that, to me, perfectly summarizes just how convoluted this mystery gets. Mr. Fisk joins a depressingly long list of people like Ed Burns as people accused of killing Betty while at the same time not existing. If you actually read the Wikipedia page, it is stated that this Fisk fella committed the act by traveling through time. Seems likely to me. This Wikipedia entry was actually added 10 years ago, and for some reason he is still in the Black Dahlia Wikipedia as an original suspect to this day. Now obviously, like stated earlier, this is a prank and of course isn't actually the suspect behind this all. But after going through some of the pretty dark ones, I thought this was an honestly humorous moment of brevity and further goes to show just how insane this case can get. Next up on our long list of suspects is, like last time, a pretty crazy one, but obviously not as absurd as the last one. His name was Corporal Joseph Dumais, and his situation was quite strange. He was one of the early suspects involved in the case, and unlike most of these suspects, he actually completely admitted to being behind it all. The thing is though, is that this was completely untrue. His reasoning for being behind it all was claimed to have dated Betty literally right before she was killed, and then claiming to have blacked out for multiple days during that span. This confession is easily debunked as being completely untrue. Firstly, we know that leading up to Betty's final days, she was with Robert Manley. And secondly, and more importantly, it was concluded that Dumais was actually stationed in Fort Dix, New Jersey during this time span. So, what he was saying was completely false. After this was proven, Dumais was dropped as being a potential lead, and the paper stopped covering him. The next question that we asked ourselves was, well, why would he do this? I first thought of a possible mental illness, but when looking, there was no confirmed cases of this being the case. The much more likely scenario was simply that he was just looking for notoriety and attention, which he definitely got as he was considered one of the top suspects for a short while. As we have shown though, of course, it wasn't him, so let's just move on. This next lead is another pretty ridiculous one and is only a lead because of the ludicrous thinking of the 1940s. People thought that because Betty left her bags at the bus depot and that she had survived a week without changing clothes, she had to have had someone with her. Naturally, they assumed it was a woman. They then very quickly jumped to the conclusion that it must have been a lesbian doctor, and this doctor killed Betty because of a love triangle. This side of the investigation has caused various retellings of Betty's story to list her as a lesbian when that was not true. In fact, it was quite the opposite, as she was said to be quite homophobic. No, with such a ridiculous theory of her being killed by some hypothetical lesbian doctor, I originally dismissed this most likely non-existent suspect because I couldn't possibly rationalize that people actually believed in this theory. But this theory was actually mentioned countless times, such as James Ellroy's famous 1987 novel, Black Dahlia, and its subsequent 2006 film adaptation, making this one a pretty popular theory. Out of all the ridiculous suspects we have listed thus far, this one stands alone in the fact that there literally isn't even a suspect. This is all purely a hypothetical scenario derived from the thinking of the 1940s and the awful assumption that lesbians are murderous monsters. It is incredibly easily debunked in case you actually did believe this one, which apparently some people still do. Again, Betty was homophobic, which already throws this theory on its head. And also, the number of female surgeons at this time in the United States was remarkably slim. By the 1970s, the number of female surgeons in the United States was 6%, and a number that was even smaller in 1947. For both of these reasons and the ridiculous nature of this entire suspect, obviously this one is debunked. The next suspect we had to cover is the most important one in the entire video, and if you have any familiarity with this case, I'm sure you guys were getting ready for his name to be finally shown, and that is, of course, George Hill Hodel Jr. George Hodel is by far the most famous suspect in this entire case and among the public. He is commonly considered the man that did it, and this is all due to the actions of his son Steve Hodel, who was a former LAPD detective who came out with an immense amount of information as to why his dad was, in fact, the killer all along. Trust me, we're going to get to his claims, but first, let's take a look at George Hodel's life. George Hodel, in his earlier years, was a talented pianist at a very young age and a genius, scoring an incredibly high IQ score of 186. Whether this is true is unclear at best, as you'll soon see. A little later on, George Hodel operated a clinic that helped poor African Americans that lived in a part of town called Bronzeville, and in the early 1940s, he supposedly got into this extreme surrealist art movement where he befriended this man named Man Ray, which, believe me, is something we will get back to a little later. His first notable moment of controversy came in 1945, though, as his secretary, Ruth Spaulding, committed suicide. Steve claims it was murder, but we'll get to that. Fast forwarding to 1947, when Betty was killed, anyone with a medical background was under suspicion. In 1949, there was actually a trial against George by his daughter Tamar, who claimed that he was sexually abusing her. Because of that trial, George now came into the police's attention and was officially a suspect. After becoming a sudden hotspot for the police, they wiretapped his home, and these recordings gave us some of the most famous pieces of evidence regarding his case. But when you look more into them, you'll realize that these moments were wildly taken out of context. For starters, after having his house wiretapped for some time, they eventually moved on, clearly showing us that they didn't perceive any of his actions as being threatening. So that should really be more than enough evidence to dismiss anything you hear from these wiretapping recordings. But for the hell of it, we'll look into some of these moments anyways. The most famous moment in these recordings was when he said, "Suppose I did kill the Black Dahlia. They couldn't prove it now." Now look, if what he said here was really as shocking as it had been made out to be, the cops would have came and arrested him on the spot. But after a few whole weeks of listening to him, they likely knew that George was aware of the recordings and didn't take such comments seriously. Anyways, like we stated a few times earlier, after some time, the police came up with the conclusion that he wasn't the killer after all, and simply moved on. Now, if you aren't familiar with the case, you're probably wondering why George Hodel is such a popular suspect in this case, and that's where Steve fully comes in. After George's death in 1999, Steve wanted to discover more about his dad. He claims to have found 2 photos in his basement when he was looking through his dad's stuff, and these 2 photos he found strongly resembled Betty, which sent him on a hunt to uncover the truth about if his dad was truly behind the Black Dahlia murder all along. He published his findings and became so famous that as of now, he's a best-selling novelist and he has appeared in episodes of TV shows like Ghost Adventures and The Dr. Phil Show. Even from the very beginning of this story, we can already find flaws in his claims. He wasn't even the first person to accuse George of being a murderer in a book, as that honor goes to a woman named Janice Knowlton. She accused George Hodel in 1998 of murdering Betty along with her father, George Knowlton. George Knowlton didn't kill Betty, just for the record. Janice was a troubled woman who suffered from mental illnesses and sadly took her own life in 2004. But when looking into Steve, there's a lack of credit there, as he instead mentions the photos. Which, speaking of, those 2 photos that he claimed were Betty have both been debunked. The first picture was identified as a person named Maria Marco, and the second photo was debunked by Betty's family themselves. Steve himself says that it doesn't matter if these photos were Betty or not, because they just serve to spark his interest in the case. And to that I say, yes, he is right about that. But the thing is, these 2 photos were the only evidence period that shows that they even knew each other, as there isn't any other evidence out there that shows that these 2 people actually knew each other at all. This is only the first point, but this foreshadows the consistent wrong information that Steve seems to deploy as evidence. You see, the amount of claims Steve Hodel has made is way too many to count. But for the sake of debunking his case, for you guys, we're going to show you guys a lot of them, and why they are completely false. One of the pieces of evidence that he likes using is the aforementioned case of the trial George Hodel had against his daughter, Tamar, who claimed he molested her. The thing is though, is that he was not found guilty, and some of the information that was discussed during the trial was very telling. Tamar's mother during the trial explained that her child was a problem child and actually had a frequent history of claiming molestation against men. According to her mother, Tamar threatened molestation over a dozen boys in her high school, and none of them were ever charged. So Steve's main claim against his father, being this monster of a person, has been debunked. One of the other claims that George was this horrible person revolves around the whole secretary situation we discussed a while back. Steve, of course, claims that his father was behind it all, but remember that it was a suicide. One of Steve's other main claims against his father relates to his interest in the previously mentioned abstract art, where he befriended his artist named Man Ray. No, not that Man Ray, which supposedly gave George the inspiration to cut Betty's body after she was killed. The thing is though, George barely knew Man Ray. Man Ray's life was pretty well documented, and there is actually an extensive archive of him online, but there is only one point in the entire archive where George is mentioned, and it's very impersonal. You'd think that if they were these intimate friends like Steve suggested, he'd at least be mentioned more times than once, or maybe even more thoroughly. But let's say that George didn't actually know Man Ray that well, and was simply inspired by his art, and as such, chopped up Betty as a result of that. Well, when looking through Man Ray's catalog, there is one piece of art called the Minotaur that Steve claims inspired George to do what he did. The artwork was simply the upper torso of somebody, and to me, at least, calling it the inspiration for Betty's body is such an absurd stretch. The photo was also only shown in French magazines exclusive to France. Someone like George would never have seen it. Now obviously that last point discussed the mutilation done to the body, and that works as a perfect segue into the next claim for Steve, which is the fact that his father was a skilled surgeon. But was he though? Well, in short, no. While George did have some expertise in public health, and actually did run a clinic to help out poor African Americans at the time, there is absolutely no evidence that he was a surgeon. George couldn't even practice surgery because he lacked the certification necessary to practice it from the American College of Surgeons. Without that credential, he would never be allowed to practice it, and with a body that had work that could have only been done by an expert, George could never have done this since there's no way he would ever be able to practice surgery in the first place. Steve also likes to claim that the LAPD knew George was the killer, and there was a great conspiracy to cover it all up because George had blackmail on various LAPD officials and politicians. He further claims that in 1949, an abortion doctor named Eric Kirk was quickly arrested and thrown in jail. This was done to prevent him spilling the beans about George's illegal activities and additionally cover up the disappearance and likely murder of a woman named Jean Spangler, another of George's supposed countless victims. He believes this because Spangler's purse was found with a note written to someone named Kirk. Steve also likes to claim that his theory garnered universal support among law enforcement. First off, people like Brian Carr, a modern-day LAPD detective, Gary Ingmanson of the Los Angeles Police Protection League, and Ed Jokish, who was a working officer in 1947, all heavily disagree with Steve's conclusions. Jokish especially was vitriolic since he and his partner arrested Eric Kirk and thus was supposedly in on the conspiracy, so it's no surprise he pointed out several discrepancies with Steve's story. Starting with the fact Jean Spangler disappeared in October of 1949, and Eric was arrested in September of 1948, so he couldn't have been involved. Also, he wasn't quickly thrown in jail. His trial lasted until 1949. Both officers have stated that the abortion ring Eric Kirk was involved in had no blackmail on any LAPD official. Detectives like Finis Brown and Harry Hansen, the people in charge of the Dahlia case, were not involved in a cover-up. Neither was Chief William Parker, Captain Jack Donahue, or Chief of Detectives Thad Brown. These were good, honest people, and they really tried their best to catch Betty's killer. They had just so little to go on that it was nearly impossible to solve, so making them look like the type of people that would look the other way for a serial killer is, in my book, highly disrespectful. Corruption wasn't unheard of in the LAPD in the 1940s, but this isn't an example of it. For being by far the most famous suspect in the entire case, going as far as blatantly stating it when you Google who killed the Black Dahlia, It is pretty shocking that literally all of Steve's claims against his father have been completely debunked, completely ruling out any possibility that he was, in fact, the man that killed Betty. But just to show you how outrageous his claims get, he published a book in 2009 that also claimed his dad was the Zodiac Killer. Just like how Larry was able to factually debunk all of Steve's claims in this Black Dahlia case, longtime researchers in the Zodiac case were also able to completely debunk the connection there too. Now, since this video isn't about that topic, we aren't going to be covering it, but we will leave this site in question in the description below. Steve has also claimed that George was the real lipstick killer and the Philippines jigsaw killer. Basically, the reason why I wanted to mention these is to further let you all know not to believe Steve's claims like nearly everybody else does. Overall, Steve Hodel is one of those guys that you can listen to and just get sucked into, despite his enormous amount of incorrect information. When he speaks, you just want to believe him. For whatever reason, he is an incredibly convincing speaker, and this is obviously why he's become so famous in recent years. His experience as an LAPD detective also sounds like it might make him more trustworthy, but I cannot stress it enough. The claims he has made against his father being the Black Dahlia killer are completely false, despite how convincing he makes them sound. So with all that being said, we only have one more suspect to talk about, and he was saved up until the end for an incredibly good reason. Let's just get right into him. The final suspect is Walter Alonzo Bailey, and the reason we saved him for last is because he is the only person out of every known suspect that has legitimate evidence that shows that he could have actually done it. Now, instead of talking about his early life and then why he could be the man who did it, like we have done with every other person on this list, I instead wanted to go through how Larry discovered it because it, yet again, featured some monumental research and is backed by some legitimately shocking moments. According to Larry, this all started in 1996, while he was researching this case for the 50th anniversary of the murder. People were sending in pieces of evidence they found that were marginally related to the case. The majority of these findings, while interesting, were in the end just throwaways. During this research, Larry consulted with the legendary criminal profiler John E. Douglas, famous for having played a role in the capture of the Trailside Killer and the Atlanta Child Killer. His conversations with infamous monsters like Charles Manson, David Berkowitz, Ted Bundy, and John Wayne Gacy helped advance understanding of criminal psychology. He's basically the inspiration for half the cast of Criminal Minds, and his book Mindhunters was turned into a popular Netflix show. Douglas put together a profile for the killer, and while even he would admit it's not perfect, it does narrow down the list a little bit. This is an abbreviated version of what Douglas wrote.
He was a white man, no younger than his late 20s and possibly older, with a high school education. He lived alone, made his living working with his hands rather than his brains, was adept with a knife, and was comfortable wallowing in blood. He was rigid, patient, compulsive, and deliberate. He drank alcohol, and when he was drunk, he became argumentative. He probably had a police record for either threatening or assaulting someone with a knife. The killer was under great personal and financial stress. He and Short spent several days together. He had been drinking. Maybe he had a physical handicap or stuttered, and Short made fun of it, but she rejected him. The mixture of personal stress, alcohol, and rejection exploded into a murderous rage. Cutting the body in half was simply to make transportation easier. But the level of mutilation reflects a personal rage directed at Short. He was dehumanizing her and defeminizing her, and then he cuts that smile on her face. You can just imagine him saying, "Look who has the last laugh now." But why Norton Avenue? The killer took a high risk to place the body where he did, because he wanted to put the fear of God in that neighborhood. Under the influence of alcohol, he is drawn like a magnet to that area. He must have had some connection to the neighborhood. Whatever the reason, Norton Avenue was a deliberate choice. Why weren't there other killings? Maybe the killer was never under the same kind of stress. Perhaps he died.
Again, like even Douglas himself stated, this profile most definitely isn't perfect. A lot of what he said was purely hypothetical, such as the age he came up with and the motive for killing that he came up with, among other things. But Douglas most definitely did raise some very interesting points, like why this location was chosen. Eventually, one day, Larry received a letter much like all the other ones he had gotten, but this one was a bit different, and it would send him down a fascinating direction. He received a photocopy of an old wedding certificate between Betty's sister Virginia and a man named Adrian West, and it showed that they got married in Inglewood. It gave an address, but he originally didn't think much of this and simply tossed it aside like he did with most of the other things he received at the time. One day, though, he decided to explore Inglewood and find the home where Virginia and Adrian got married. When he did, he was met with a shocking discovery. This home was on South Norton Avenue and was only 1 block away from where the murder took place. Because the certificate he had on him was a photocopy, he wanted to find a real copy just to make sure, and when he did, it relayed the same information. He now had 2 members of the Short family connected within a block of each other. It was addressed to Barbara Lindgren, so now Larry's next step was to figure out who she was. Figuring out who Barbara was a long and strenuous process. He started out by directly reaching out to Virginia and Adrian's children and gave him a backstory on how Adrian and Virginia met in the first place. Adrian actually enlisted in the Navy during World War II and was staying at the University of Southern California, where he was going through something called the V-12 program. During this, he was transferred to MIT, and this was when he met Virginia, Betty's sister. He was actually transferred back to LA at one point, and when this happened, he asked her to marry him, and she said yes. That's when a very quick, frantic wedding was put together. The minister who set the wedding up was from Adrian's church. The home the wedding took place at belonged to a couple from the church. The members of the wedding were all from the church, and one of these members was Barbara Lindgren. The address on the wedding certificate that had Barbara's name on it, after a ridiculous amount of searching, turned out to belong to Ruth Bailey, who was Barbara's mother. But Larry's heart dropped when he found out Barbara's father, Walter Bailey. Walter Bailey was a prominent surgeon. Now we have a man who knew Betty's family, only lived a block away, and was a surgeon. This is by far the most convincing lead out of anything yet. It doesn't end there though, because while the aforementioned information already makes him more likely than any other suspect listed previously, his motive still needed to be determined. Well, apparently in the mid-1940s, Walter Bailey was a prominent member of the LA medical community and even had a private workspace just 5 blocks away from the Biltmore Hotel, which was where Betty was last seen. Bailey was born on March 25, 1880, the second of 3 brothers and a sister. Bailey graduated in 1905 and quickly became the associate professor of surgery at the University of Southern California. He specialized in women's surgery and treatment. In 1910, he moved to a small town of Dawson, New Mexico, and worked as a surgeon for the coal mining company stationed there. He enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1918 and served in World War I as a surgeon. He left in 1919. After the war, he moved to Los Angeles and stayed there for the rest of his life. In 1946, things would change for Bailey though. He lost his positions as the chief of staff at County Hospital and associate professor of surgery at USC. He was now under financial stress. To make matters worse, he found a woman named Alexandra von Partica. Sorry if I butchered that. Alexandria was a nurse, and this newfound romantic relationship caused Bailey to file for divorce. And to somehow make matters even worse, he also started showing the early signs of Alzheimer's disease, which was ultimately the cause of his death. He also suffered from a condition that causes the brain to physically shrink. A few weeks before he died, he changed his will and left everything to Alexandria. But because the divorce still wasn't final, Ruth carried out a lawsuit and spine-chillingly claimed that Alexandria knew a terrible secret about him that would ruin him if he became public. The type of condition that Bailey suffered from has been known to trigger violence in people with no record. People close to Bailey claimed he was a kind man, but he wasn't the same person he was in his final years. He was also very desensitized to violence, reportedly watching filmed autopsies and surgeries with his mistress while eating dinner. Another important detail is that Bailey had a son named Walter Prescott Bailey, who was hit by a car at the age of 11. Betty had a sob story she would use involving losing a son, and she would often use this to garner sympathy. Walter Prescott's birthday was January 13th, and Betty was killed either late on the 14th or early on the 15th. It's plausible that Betty had gone to ask Bailey for financial help and ended up staying for a few days. At one point, she may have mentioned the dead son story and accidentally sent the mentally ill doctor off. Now, that's completely a hypothetical scenario and may not be why he did what he did, but the fact remains that Bailey's resume is way too convincing to overlook. He was a skilled surgeon. He lived 1 block away from the spot Betty was found at. His private workspace was 5 blocks away from the hotel that Betty was last seen at. And he was literally proven to know her, which would explain the missing pages in Betty's address book. You would only remove pages if she had written the killer's name down prior to her death. While not exact, Bailey fits John Douglas's profile better than any suspect in the case. It would also explain where there was no other murder quite like Betty's in LA history. If it was Bailey, this wasn't the work of a serial killer. Rather, it was one murder committed by a man with a quickly failing mind. the evidence in favor of Walter Bailey is far less flimsy than the countless other suspects. Fast forwarding back to the present, the Black Dahlia mystery is arguably one of the most famous unsolved murder mysteries in the history of the United States, and may also hold the record for being one of the most misinformed mysteries of all time. Whether it's the complete tainted legacy of Betty as a person, or the countless myths throughout history as a result of yellow journalism, we knew we had to cover this mystery because of all that. This mystery makes Jack the Ripper look like Clue by comparison, and much like the Ripper, various pieces of media have been made about it, countless books, films, video games, songs, and even an American death metal band. All of this off the back of a poor woman so undeserving of her fate. And with all being said and done, did we debunk this mystery? Well, as incredibly convincing as Walter Bailey's is, I still can't say that we did. Although we were certainly as close to it as we could get. Unsolved murders like these are almost truly impossible to debunk, and that is why we always stay away from them. But we had to make an exception for the Black Dahlia, as it is possibly the most intriguing yet convoluted mystery that you will ever see in your lifetime, and we needed to tell it right. Thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to follow all of our social medias for updates and exclusive content, all linked in the description. Especially consider joining our Patreon, as even $1 a month really helps and you guys get some awesome little rewards, and it really helps out the channel. Of course, make sure to like this video, share this with your friends, and subscribe. As always, my name is Seb from Debunk File. Thank you guys so much for watching. Bye.